This is Thursday, November 19th, 2020 work session of the Portland City Council. Today, we are here to talk about homelessness and here together. And I'll start by turning this over to Commissioner Ryan. Commissioner Ryan.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor. Excuse me. And good afternoon, colleagues. Today, we are discussing the Metro Here Together supportive housing services measure that was passed by voters in the Tri-County area, Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington counties this past spring. We will hear a presentation about the draft of that local implementation plan. And all of us know the urgency, rather the emergency of this issue. In fact, all of us identify the houselessness crisis as one of the top 3 priorities facing our city when asked in a work session this past month. And all of us in the sector have seen the polling from voters. This has been the top issue facing our city consistently for at least the last 5 years. Portlanders are kind, they're generous, and they're compassionate. They understand that houselessness is not a choice and that there are complex layers to this vulnerable experience. My hope for today is to take the information that's being shared with us and complement it with hundreds of constituent inquiries we all receive every day. We know Portlanders are concerned about the safety and well-being of our most vulnerable, and that is not the debate. The concern is how are we going to get results. We'll be hearing a presentation from the staff of the Joint Office of Homeless Services, who are going to provide an overview of the Metro Supportive Housing Services Measure, the draft of the implementation plan, an update thus far of the community engagement that has been done over the last couple of months to provide a vision for the draft of the local implementation plan, and a summary of the key elements and proposed investments during the phase 1 of this draft. After that, we'll hear some invited testimony. Then we will open it up for dialogue with my colleagues. And as a point of order, I'd like to ask if you'd consider holding your questions until the presentation and testimony is complete, so then we can dive in for the second half of our time together and provide necessary feedback on this draft of the local implementation plan. Before handing it over to Mark Jolin and the Joint Office for Homeless Services for the presentation, I'd like to encourage us to consider the following. There are so many ways the conversation can go around houselessness, but in this work session, we want to stay focused on the local implementation plan for Metro's Here Together measure. Specifically, Metro LIP will raise money for supportive housing services for folks experiencing houselessness or at risk of experiencing houselessness. 75% of the funding is dedicated to supports for folks experiencing chronic houselessness. We know that 70% of the folks experienced chronic houselessness experience behavioral health challenges, substance abuse disorders, addictions, and many times both. People with these challenges are slipping through the cracks of our community support systems, and they desperately need us to be creative about the services we offer them. Portlanders know that these neighbors need our help, and Portlanders are compassionate about investing in services and systems to achieve better results. I will now turn it over to Mark Jolin, Joint Office for Homeless Services. Keyword on Mark's title is the word joint. He has the distinction of serving both the county and the city, and that alone makes you a pioneer. Mark, welcome, and please take it away for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner, Mayor, Commissioners-elect. I am Mark Jolin. I'm the Director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services for the City of Portland and for Multnomah County. I am here today, and I want to briefly introduce them with 2 of my colleagues. Joshua Bates is with us today. He's the Equity Manager for the Joint Office. And Nui Bazair is a management analyst in our office who is overseeing the creation of the local implementation plan. You'll have a chance to meet both of them. I'm going to take just a few minutes at the beginning to set the framework of the measure. Commissioner Ryan has given you a lot of the high-level context, but I'll go a little bit deeper. I want to recognize before I start that Director Shannon Callahan is here. As Commissioner Ryan mentioned, This is a Metro Supportive Housing Services measure, and the supportive housing is central to that. And we work very closely, as you know, with the Portland Housing Bureau on the creation of supportive housing inventory in our community. And I know she's here and happy to answer questions when we get into that phase. So I'm going to take just a moment to share my screen. Okay. And as usual, I'm not going to be able to see more than a couple of people. So I know Commissioner Ryan asked that you hold questions, but if there's something that you want me to clarify, please go off mute and feel free to let me know. I'll be happy to provide clarification. So we are going to talk briefly about the supportive housing services measure largely, and we'll talk specifically about the community engagement that's gone into the local implementation plan as we have it currently, and then talk about some of the elements, the investment priorities in particular, and some next steps. So we got to the measure, essentially, as Commissioner Ryan said, I think out of a recognition in our community that we face an enormous crisis. We have long faced a crisis in affordable housing, and in particular, affordable housing that rents at levels that are affordable to someone who is making 30% of area median income and below. Within the population of people experiencing homelessness in our community, the significant majority of them are well below 30%. An SSI check in our community is about half of that, or if half of that. So that deficit of some 30,000 units is a central feature of the challenge that we face. We've also seen a persistent increase in the number of people experiencing chronic homelessness in our community. Between 2017 and 2019, that percentage jumped by 37%, even though the overall HUD homeless population, folks sleeping outside and in shelter and transitional housing, actually only grew by about 4%. So we've seen a significantly, disproportionately large increase in chronic homelessness. And within that, we have had, for as long as we have been tracking this systematically, significant overrepresentation of different communities of color in the homeless population. And what we have seen in the most recent point in time counts is that overrepresentation is showing up and actually becoming greater in the chronic population as well. And what you see in this chart on this page is the rate of growth of chronic homelessness over a 2-year period for individual communities of color. You also see with the Native American community in particular that 51.8% of the people who we counted in the point in time count identified as Native and chronic. So that within the Native community, and that's the highest rate of chronic homelessness in any community, including non-Hispanic whites. We also adopted this measure, voters adopted this measure in the context of some policy priorities that we had identified as a community. The first is the 2,000 unit goal that this council and the county commission set in 2017, 2,000 units of new supportive housing. And the chart you see on the right demonstrates the progress that we have made collectively, again, in partnership with the Portland Housing Bureau, the progress we've made towards that 2,000 unit goal, but we still have a long way to go. And the resources in particular for rent assistance and support services have been lacking as we look forward to how are we going to reach this 2,000 unit goal. The Portland Bond and the Metro Affordable Housing Bond both created capital with which to build new affordable housing, but did not come with the operating subsidies and the services, certainly not at the level we need to fully maximize the opportunity with those measures to expand supportive housing and meet the needs of the chronically homeless population. And I will say that there's also a need to continue to find new capital resources to meet these goals. But the Metro measure really emerged out of a recognition that we needed that operating support and service support to complement the capital. And then finally, a growing recognition that this crisis is not Portland, it is not Multnomah County, it is absolutely regional. Of course, it's national and statewide as well. But we have not historically worked well as a region on this, and there was an urgent need to begin to do that. And thus, the voters passed the Metro Supportive Housing Services Program, which I will say in all the years I've been doing this work, this is the most exciting moment for us, as challenging as COVID is, and it is an enormous challenge for us. We're facing it at a time when we actually have this amazing opportunity as a community to make real headway against some of these daunting challenges related to chronic homelessness in particular. This measure, as the commissioner said, does prioritize that population of people who are extremely low income and have disabling conditions and have long experiences of homelessness. And it also sets aside resources for people who are experiencing less chronic forms of homelessness, episodic homelessness, or who are just facing a significant risk of homelessness. The measure centers on communities of color. It really recognizes that within those populations of need, the investments need to focus first on communities of color, whether it's chronically homeless individuals who are in the Native community or families of color that are experiencing the threat of eviction. And then finally, this measure really does create a foundation for a regional approach. Not only does it distribute the money to each of the counties, but it sets the expectation that we will develop very soon a regional planning body. We set aside an allocation of funds every year to regional initiatives. And as I've worked on this measure over the last several months with my colleagues in Washington Clackamas County, it's becoming clear that there is no way to successfully implement this measure that doesn't involve really close regional coordination and collaboration. Originally, the measure was projected to bring in $248 million a year for the region. The resources are allocated, generally speaking, based on where the funds are collected. That put Multnomah County at about 45.3% for at least the first couple of years of the revenues coming into Multnomah County. And 5% of that is set aside for regional priorities, as I said. I'm putting originally projected here because right now with COVID and the unknown impact that it's going to have on the economy, some time issues around the collection of tax revenue, just in general, anytime you have a new tax revenue measure, we're not entirely certain how much money is going to come in. What we've been given as a planning estimate for Metro for year one is $52 million. That's a little less than half of what some of the projections were initially. The first tax year is calendar year 21. That means the first prepayment funds are going to come in April. That means that we'll be able to start spending these dollars no earlier than essentially July, so the beginning of next fiscal year, and that's what we're aggressively working towards. Metro oversees the collection and expenditure of the revenues. The City of Portland is the tax collecting entity for the region for this measure, and I think someone is here from Revenue to answer questions if you have questions about that. And then our commitment to Metro is that we will implement and spend the money consistent with the principles that we articulate and the priorities we set in the local implementation plan, which is why that work is so critical. It's called a supportive housing services measure. And because of that, I think it's really important to hold on to the fact that this measure authorizes really two different types of investments. Rent assistance, very fundamentally, so that operating support for project-based supportive housing or a voucher program, which we'll talk more about, that's mirrored around Section 8, for example, a long-term voucher program, and then also any forms of short-term rent assistance are eligible expenses here. And then we can invest dollars in support services, and you'll see that's pretty broadly defined. It's important to reiterate that this measure is about getting people permanently housed. And so that as we look at the support services that we're investing in, it's about how do we use those to get people into housing and then ensure that they are able to stay in that housing, right? That's the supportive services part of permanent supportive housing. Metro, the measure itself is actually quite detailed in terms of what we are required to do, what we are allowed to do, how we're supposed to go about the work. And then Metro has done some additional planning to further frame up how we're supposed to approach the implementation of this measure. Over the summer, they convened a stakeholder group, and among the things that stakeholder group did was to identify the metrics that we would have to account to as we implement and as Washington Clackamas County as well. So these are the metrics for the measure as a whole, and they're going to apply uniformly across the three counties. They're in three categories. One is housing stability. So this goes to that idea that this measure is going to be assessed, its effectiveness is going to be assessed in terms of how many people are we actually moving into housing and then ensuring are able to stay housed. So these are housing stability measures, how many placements, what are the retention rates over time. And then there's a category around equitable service delivery, and this gets back to the essential focus on racial equity in particular in this measure. We are expected to show increased investments in culturally specific services and ensuring that services are culturally responsive. And we are expected to disaggregate all of the outcomes that we are collecting in this measure and demonstrate that we are reducing disparities on the basis of race and for other historically marginalized communities. So that equitable service delivery set of metrics is about that. And then finally, this measure, and it's a commitment that we have, and you'll see it in the process that we've run, but this measure looks to us to demonstrate that people with lived experience, and in particular, people of color with lived experience, are involved in the decision-making at every level of the implementation of this measure. This is Metro's timeline, just to illustrate for you why things are moving so quickly. So again, the measure passed in May. June to September, Metro was doing work to sort of set the guidelines for us, those values, the metrics, and what needed to be in the local implementation plan specifically. So we weren't able to start that work until September, and we dove in, but we actually have to finish it essentially by December, because as you'll see at the end, the process for approval of the LIP will take us into December locally. Then we hand the document off to Metro. It goes through a review with its newly convened oversight committee. And then once they've approved it, the Metro Council needs to adopt the measure or the LIP as part of the intergovernmental agreement between Multnomah County and Metro. So the timeline for this is compressed, and it's why this document will, and we're being really explicit about this, is a high-level framework that sets a direction. It doesn't make a lot of specific investment decisions, except in this sort of year one, phase one category you'll hear about. So that is my overview. And then I'm going to hand it off to Joshua Bates. Again, Joshua is our equity manager in the Joint Office and has been leading the community engagement work for this measure.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today. So today I'm going to be providing a review of the community engagement process that we utilize to generate the local implementation plan. As Mark sort of outlined, we've been facilitating community engagement since September. For about 2 months, the Joint Office of Homeless Services has conducted a robust community engagement process with the intent of creating a local implementation plan that really centered and represented the urgent need that our community is experiencing in regards to homelessness. In regards to jurisdictional coordination, which is really the spirit of this measure, and there was 3 different levels to it. There was internal coordination within the county, within Multnomah County. There was external coordination with our jurisdictional partners, which includes the City of Portland, which includes Home Forward, which includes Gresham, Troutdale, and Fairview. And then finally, there's a 3rd level, which is that regional coordination and alignment. And that happened with the Tri-County and Metro planning groups, and with to strategize and coordinate access to services across the region. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So we facilitate an inclusive, the purpose of all of this was to facilitate an inclusive community engagement process to receive feedback from community members on priority services and programs for the local implementation plan. We did all this while also reckoning with the realities of COVID-19, which drastically shifted how we historically would have facilitated such a process. What we ended up doing is we facilitated engagements in multiple different ways. We did that through facilitated discussions. We had over 70 of those. We had individual stakeholder conversations, and we sent out and generated 2 different surveys. Go on to the next slide. Thanks, Mark. It's kind of awkward not being able to control it yourself. So this is the list of the different groups that we engaged with. We engaged with different organizations, different groups, different committees and councils. And through all of this, we were able to engage with hundreds and hundreds of constituents. The priority with all of this engagement, though, as Mark said, is really racial equity. And racial equity and engaging with communities of color and engaging with folks with lived experience of homelessness. Through that engagement, we also, in the actual conversations on facilitated dialogue, dialogues, we prioritize racial equity through the actual construction of the engagements and the type of questions we asked. Some of the different communities that we engaged with were the business communities, the neighborhood associations, faith groups, culturally specific providers, mental health and recovery service providers, and service providers more broadly. Can we go on to the next slide? There we go. So as I said, we also facilitated multiple surveys, and these surveys were facilitated actually through the Street Roots vendor infrastructure. So although we're reckoning with the realities of COVID-19, we also understood the importance of actually doing that face-to-face engagement. And originally, we were only going to engage with about 100 to 200 individuals through this, but through Street Roots diligence and through their connections, we were actually able to talk to over 383 unsheltered individuals through that process, 143 of who were BIPOC. Additionally, we used the Home for Everyone listserv and connections to disseminate surveys in which we had over 500 responses. And really through all of this, through all of these different engagements, through these individual stakeholder conversations, through these facilitated dialogues, through the different surveys, we were able to generate a local implementation plan that really prioritized feedback from our community and actually use that feedback to generate the local implementation plan. So right now we're currently in the process of going back and forth with the Home for Everyone's coordinating board to get this local implementation plan to a format that really does represent the needs of all of our community, as well as the Home for Everyone coordinating board. So with that, I'm going to complete my section. Sorry if that seemed a little rushed. I do want to be cognizant of time. So Mark, I will pass it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Joshua. And I am going to ask Nui to join us and take over the next section of this presentation.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you everyone again for having us. Mark, you can advance to the next slide. So I'm just going to run through, what the kind of structure and requirements are of what we're creating right now, which Josh mentioned, our local implementation plan for this program. Mark already reiterated that this is really meant to be a high-level strategy document. That's both due to the kind of time frame that we were given, and also we're also constricted in the number of pages. So you'll see here that there's a number of different required elements for this local implementation plan, which have been developed by Metro. We're going to focus on two key ones in this presentation. One will be on the racial equity analysis. We'll give a little bit of information there. Also, kind of the meat of the document really is, what are we spending the money on? What are those planned investments? So we'll give some high-level information about what those are in our plan. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So both Commissioner Ryan and Mark already spoke to, who is being served by this program, but I just wanted to bring the point home. Really this program is meant to serve households who are experiencing or at substantial risk of homelessness, and those are very low-income households. The program prioritizes a subset of that group, and that really is folks who, for lack of a better term, are chronically homeless. But we're not necessarily using that term with this program because HUD definitions kind of paint a more restrictive picture of that. But you can see the details under this first bullet point of what qualities do those households have that meet that definition? So extremely low income, one or more disabling condition, and experiencing long-term or at risk of experiencing long-term homelessness. So really the program is designed to meet the housing needs of that specific population, although it can, benefit folks who are more broadly homeless or at risk of homelessness. And of course, this has already been reiterated, we are prioritizing communities of color. Next slide. So in the plan is a high-level racial equity analysis that incorporates both the rich feedback gained from the community engagement process that Josh had just covered. And then also we have included the best available data we had at our fingertips in the amount of time that we were given to create this report. The analysis really, also points to the historic and current racism that has caused disparities among communities of color in many ways, especially in how communities of color present in the homeless system, how they're able to access or not access services within the homeless system. And then also there are disparities in the outcomes of those programs. So the analysis goes over, again, at a high level, all of those aspects. There is a chart here that we'll just point out as one example. This chart really speaks to returns to homelessness by race and ethnicity. The kind of darker green bar on the left really is the average rate of return into homelessness. So, this is a graph where you don't want to see high percentages. You want to see lower percentages, because this says that in the last, or folks that were housed 2 years ago permanently, have they since returned back into the homeless system? So all the folks that have the reddish color bar, so that would be Black and African American communities, American Indian, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, all experienced higher rates of returns to homelessness. So that's just one example of where communities of color are experiencing worse outcomes than both white households and then also just the overall average. Move on to the next slide, please. So in the racial equity analysis in the plan, there are specific strategies, I shouldn't say specific, high-level strategies that are outlined to address some of these disparities. So these strategies show up both in this section, but then also are reflected in the investments that are outlined in a different section. So these really speak a lot to strengthening the capacity of culturally specific providers, ensuring that our system itself has more capacity to deliver culturally specific services across the continuum from outreach up through tenancy supports. This is very important too, that we're trying as a system to the best of our ability to offer more flexible resources. So that's more flexible rent assistance programs. The way services are offered should be more flexible, and that's both in intensity and duration. So this measure, it gives us the ability to do that. And we're just kind of saying, we've heard that this is needed and we can respond with this program to meet that need. Move on to the next slide, please. So now we're going to jump into what the investments actually are, or at least at a very high level, what are the strategies for what we plan to invest in the first 3 years. Those strategies were created, they're grounded in the community engagement and the data and based on the analyses that are in the plan. Also are developed by the guiding values and commitments that you see here. A lot of these are reiterated in the strategies to address racial equity. I'll also highlight that, we're really focusing on regional coordination, alignment, and making sure that resources are distributed equitably across both the local region in our county and then across the Tri-County area. Next slide, please. So before we go through the strategies, both more broadly and in the first year, 1 to 3 years, these are the different eligible services or activities that this program can cover. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is really just to highlight the different categories of things that can be covered by these funds. I'm going to point out that this is a housing-focused program. And so to the extent that each of these categories points a household towards permanent housing, that is what is really needed to be part of that wraparound package for each household. So you can almost picture, a household has fallen into homelessness. What are the things they need to engage them and start to build rapport out and outreach, for example, if they're living unsheltered or living with a family member? What are the different health and wellness connections that need to be made before folks are housed and when they're housed? And then, you can trail that all the way through to housing. What happens when they're actually housed? We need those services to keep them housed and stably housed. Okay. So, now we're just going to briefly go over what the overall investments look like in the plan. We are going to commit to funding supportive housing, both rent assistance and supportive services. Mark already mentioned our 2,000 unit commitment. The plan actually increases that goal to, I believe, 2,235 supportive housing units. Again, this doesn't pay for capital funds, but we'll be able to pay for the rent assistance and supportive services for those additional units. We'd like to highlight that, with services, the largest need that we saw based on community feedback is really around behavioral health services, specifically mental health and substance use recovery. And then also we want to make sure there's long-term kind of assisted care with those behavioral health services. Supportive housing also includes rent assistance, but we wanted to bring out rent assistance more broadly because, we're trying to make rent assistance be offered in a more flexible way. So rent assistance, both long-term and short-term rent assistance will be available. And long-term rent assistance will be available both that will follow the tenant, that will be kind of attached to units, and some that may be able to be master leased. So that's to really meet the needs of multiple populations. So we called out behavioral health services. We also heard the need for additional peer supports, income supports like employment and attaining benefits. Also emergency services. We recognize that, especially with COVID, as folks are becoming at risk of homelessness and folks are finding themselves living unsheltered, we need at least short-term investments in additional shelter capacity and outreach capacity. And we heard also the need for additional advocacy and legal supports. Next slide, please. So with year one, I don't want to reiterate everything I just said, but some of this is repeated because in the first 1 to 3 years, we will be launching some of the things we already talked about, for example, rent assistance. In the first year, we really want to focus on understanding and building the capacity of community-based organizations. So this is really a focus on culturally specific organizations and emerging and smaller nonprofits. So we're also understand that we need to do a lot of capacity building ourselves as planners and administrators of this program. So there will be some additional capacity resource that is provided to county departments and also our jurisdictional partners like Home Forward. And I already mentioned the supportive housing commitments. We plan to align in the first 1 to 3 years with supportive housing programs that are already in existence and just need that rent assistance and services, or that are coming online in the first 1 to 3 years. Next slide, please. We mentioned, I'm going to reiterate again, behavioral health services. We understand this is a huge need and we need to provide these services sooner rather than later. And again, that's from the continuum from outreach up through housing supports. So we'll be working closely with our county behavioral health divisions and also providers to really figure out the details of that. We have a kind of a section in our plan really around COVID response. This isn't a program that's meant to provide, COVID-related investments like CARES Act. However, we wanted to recognize that there's a high need here. We may need to fund some interventions and programs that CARES Act maybe will drop off soon, and what's going to happen after that. So, we will be able to support high-risk households in sheltering and other responses. And then finally, we just want this to have the ability to be able to have reserve funds, understanding that there's no exact policy created around that yet, and we still need to do that. But this is just to give ourselves permission as a community to have the ability to have reserve funds for this program.
All right.
So those, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's the high level snapshot of what is in the plan. The plan offers a lot more detail.
Thank you, Nui. And I'll just say, part of the reserve fund, we really understand the need to do that next level of planning with our community partners to drill down into what exactly needs to be scaled and to what level. So we have very high level direction, but as we sit down and look at the various types of interventions, there's work to do. So, while we want to get these dollars flowing and we want to make those initial rounds of long-term investments that we know are needed and some of the short-term investments, we also want to be okay with saying we don't want to build out a system that we haven't adequately sort of planned out. And so that means we have to take a little bit of time, hold some fund in reserve as we go through that process and get ready to fully implement. So the last slide, and then I think we're done, is to just kind of lay out for you that timeline that I spoke to at the beginning. And really, we're in this November, December phase. We have the draft of the plan. We're going through the second revision. We're gathering the last rounds of feedback. The plan will come to the county board in mid-December for approval, at which point it will then be handed off to Metro, again to the oversight committee. And from the oversight committee, it's subject to its approval. The plan will then be in the intergovernmental agreement that we hope is adopted by March or so, because if that is what will allow us to begin the process of actually allocating these dollars and getting them into contracts as early as July. So that is the extent of our presentation. I thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions after we have our invited guest speakers.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, Nui, and Joshua. I am now turning this over to some invited testimony. We have Tony Venezia first. You're on there, right, Tony? There you are. Welcome.
Yeah, hey, so my name's Tony. Hi, Mark. So I prepared a speech I'm going to read. I'm going to be really quick, but I just do want to say that in this process, I've seen Mark's office and his team adopt stuff that we've talked about before, and I'm just really impressed with that. And I just want to call that out and say that shows me that you guys are listening to the community. You know, I'm a person in long-term recovery. I've been in recovery over 8 years. For me, that means I haven't used any substances, committed any crimes, or been homeless. You know, additionally, I'm the executive director of an organization called 4D Recovery. We're a recovery support service provider that provides free, ongoing addiction recovery support to young adults trying to overcome addiction. You know, I'm honored to give public testimony today on behalf of my personal and professional experience and the experience and expertise of my colleagues in the recovery support sector. You know, and my goal is to help the Here Together bond implementation be effective in ending homelessness. I have 4 points and 3 recommendations. Number 1, personal experience is very important in shaping policy. You know, I was homeless, you know, using drugs, rotating in and out of jail. But in addition, I'm a person who runs a nonprofit and helps affect policy. And there's lots of people like me who are in recovery, who were formerly homeless, who run recovery organizations. And our sector is a little smaller and we're underfunded. So sometimes we can't get away to go, you know, affect public policy. So having people with lived experience and professional experience is incredibly important. You guys have somebody on the Home for Everyone board, Shannon Olive. She's a part of my Recovery Support Service Coalition. I really appreciate having her voice with you guys. You guys already called it out. I'm not going to beat the point too much, but solving homelessness is more than just housing. It's, you know, behavioral health services. We know people on the streets have substance use issues and mental health issues. And so we have to have behavioral health services embedded in any initiative to end homelessness. With respect to substance use disorder, that's what I'm an expert on, recovering from that. What we need to invest in is long-term non-clinical recovery supports. Now, these aren't just ancillary services to like big behavioral health organizations or treatment organizations, you know, and they're different from Housing First. These are services where people come and go for a long period of time, and they engage in the services that they want. This could be, you know, an Alano Club, a recovery gym, the Miracles Club, 4D recovery centers, and also sober residences as well. Lastly, I think we can use this funding, you guys called it out, to invest in culturally driven services. I'm specifically calling out for culturally driven peer-run organizations. This would be like Northwest Instituto Latino Adicciones, Painted Horse, Miracles Club, and then Shannon Olive's organization, Women's First. So my three recommendations are potentially investing the behavioral health portion of this into the county behavioral health department, because they have probably the best understanding of the landscape and what gaps there are and how we can fill them, and they understand how to contract with providers. Calling recovery support providers out in the plan, calling that out specifically those types of organizations. And then of course, prioritizing, BIPOC services, especially, intentionally supporting BIPOC-led recovery organizations. And thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Tony. Appreciate your time. And you're welcome to stay for the rest of this meeting. The next person that we have invited is Jesse Burke. And Jesse, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I wasn't totally sure what testimony was supposed to be. I'm sure a lot of you already read my letter that I sent to a zillion people. But I think the letter I wrote was kind of my testimony that for me, I've been down here for 7 years. Mark, we've been in many meetings together for many years. That's what I wrote in my letter. I was like, I have sat in so many of these meetings, and so many of these meetings, honestly, like I know you guys are doing good data collection and research, and I'm so exhausted by all of these meetings that I can't figure out how 7 years later, the needle has not moved for me down here, that I am so tired. And you saw what we experience every day. And it's not a lack of empathy that has me saying this. Like I wrote, cities are supposed to be ecosystems, that decisions are supposed to be symbiotic. And one group shouldn't suffer because a decision was made for another. And that goes both ways, but we are not making it down here. And the things that we see every day, I know no one else is living through daily. And I don't know what else to do. I don't know that I can sit through any more of these meetings talking about building more housing. Honestly, I have a real estate license too. And I was actually hired by the Portland Housing Authority, I think 3 years ago, to help find more affordable housing. And what I learned in that contract process was my task was not actually to find vacant buildings to put people in, but to find buildings that were already affordable and were already full. And that was going to count towards the total. And I was so disheartened, feeling like that's the number. The number is not to add to the list. The way that we come up with these metrics is to just take what's already there and get to add that to the list. It's not moving the needle. And so the notes I had listening through here that, I've sat in these meetings for years and I'm so tired. I feel like I'm listening to the same meeting every single time, that if the measure and the goal is to get people that are chronically homeless off the street, what if they don't want to go? That's real. That is really happening on the street with some people. It's not just that everyone's down on their luck. If you talk to Cascadia Behavioral Health, I met with the clinicians who are hiding out in the Royal Palm right now, Cascadia Behavioral Health. They visit every site, every camp twice a day. And I said, what are you seeing? And she said, people have it really good right now. We deliver food, we deliver water, services are all right here, and Clean and Safe cleans up after them. Why would you go? She said, living in housing, there are standards and expectations that you have to live by, and people don't want that. And so it doesn't matter how many units we build, unless we all agree as a society that there are certain things that are and are not acceptable in society, no one's gonna go. And maybe some people will go. We will decrease the number, but we're not gonna move the needle like we think we are. The first draft of my letter that I didn't send was, can we agree that certain things are socially unacceptable? People should not be violent publicly or privately. There should not be people having psychotic and physical crises in the middle of the street. The people should not be defecating outdoors in city areas. That I don't understand how we're to a point where all we think the problem is how many units of housing we need. Yes, to Tony, your point, it is people needing services, having some standards. As a society, we need to have some expectations, a baseline to move the needle. And I don't see that. And I keep seeing that the focus is empathy. The focus is empathy. I am as empathetic as they come. I am a former social worker, a former elementary school teacher. I've got a bunch of kids and a bunch of employees that have struggled their whole lives. But if we start with empathy and people refuse the empathy, do we not move then to something else? Do we move to, I told you this, Ted, on our walk. We have to start with empathy, 100%. But if they refuse it, is it not then, okay, well, these are the standards by which we all agree in society. I don't know if people want to live outside, but it's not really my problem that if you don't want to live in a house, you don't also get to just like live wherever you want in the middle of the city in front of my door, right? So like, how do we work with that? And so I want all of you to know, I and so many others are exhausted. I'm sure, Mark, you're exhausted. Ted, I'm sure you're exhausted. And Commissioner Fritz, everyone that has sat on all of these calls, like, we know all the reports that are coming. The data is so tiring. I'm sure the collection of the data is exhausting. And can we just like start with some like baseline standards for each other? Most of us already have them, and it's like we're just making some exceptions because we have to always be empathetic. How do we change the narrative to be, we are always empathetic, and it was rejected. And so now we all have to live by these standards. I know you guys are always fighting the public perception and the other agencies that are like, you can't criminalize this, or you can't, this is what you're saying when you do this. I know. But you also have a lot of people that know that there's a problem and that's not what you're doing, and you do have to come up with a solution. And I am happy and at your service to help with whatever that solution is. But this is, I can't sit in another meeting talking about how we're going to find more housing, because that's all we need. We just need more. I wrote down here, what if we had enough housing and people were still here? What would we do? I think that's the only scenario where we would actually have to ask ourselves the tough questions. So what if we have enough? Imagine we do, then what? So that is the end of my testimony. Also, I'm very tired.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And thank you, Tony. Your voice represents what so many of us hear from constituents, and we wanted to just lift up a couple of those voices. And your point of view is necessary for us as we deliberate and look at this draft. So thank you for taking the time to be here today. Since I have the pleasure of meeting with Mark Jolin every Monday at the end of the day, isn't that just a great meeting time? Monday at 4:30 weekly, and I know that we'll take this feedback and synthesize it and work on the draft together this Monday. I wanted to make sure that I opened up the remaining time to my colleagues. Thank you for your patience. We need to hear your point of view. And thank you, Mark, for remaining in the room, so you'll be available for any context or questions that they may have. So the floor is yours. I'm going to pretend we're all in the same room right now and just jump in, raise your hand, and we'll do the dialogue. But this is definitely time for the fellow commissioners and commissioner-elects that are on the line to engage. Thank you.
Commissioner Fritz is raising her hand. Go ahead, Commissioner Fritz, and I'll follow on behind you.
Well, thank you to Jesse and Tony, and thank you to the staff for the presentation. That was a great high-level overview. So I have three questions. One is, when do we get to see a draft of the details? Because I think the principles are clear, but the proportions of money going to what different services, I think it is crucial, particularly in the first year. So that's one question. Yeah, that's my first question. I'll let you answer them one at a time.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're just finalizing. We took the first draft to the coordinating board, I guess, last week. So we're just literally this afternoon, we're finalizing the revisions based on their first round of comments. So we can share out that second draft with you and your council colleagues. That's easy to do. The plan doesn't make specific sort of percentage allocations of resources. And we are obviously needing to come to that as we go into the budget process, so we can bring forward what we think that's going to look like in terms of the. Sorry, I'm getting.
Went in and out.
Budget process. Just kind of.
Mark, try turning your video off and say what you just said, the last sentences again, please, because we couldn't hear you.
All right, my apologies. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
Yeah, so the plan right now does not, even in the year one, sort of identify a specific allocation of funds yet. We literally have been under so much time pressure to just identify what those items would be in year one, that we're now at the same time having to go back in and say, okay, as we think about the building a budget in year one, sort of what are we going to look at? So we can bring that forward back to council as we're going through that in real time, essentially. So, and it's quantifiable in the sense that we have, that we can quantify about how many long-term vouchers we're going to need to get out into the field as some of these phase ones, and we can make some assessments of what kind of capacity building resource we're going to need to push out into the community. But there are just some discussions to have internally and with our partners around what that looks like before we can put a percentage allocation on it.
Thank you. Second, I had to miss some of the Metro Policy Advisory Council meetings while I was campaigning for the Parks Bond. Has this been discussed at MPAC?
I don't know the answer to that question, Commissioner. I'm sorry. I can find out for you, but I don't know.
I would recommend, if it hasn't, that is a policy group that's supposed to advise the Metro Council. So if the Metro Council is approving the plan, and even if they've had a briefing on the draft, I think once it's ready to go to council, I would recommend that it would go to MPAC as well. And the mayor and I would be participating in that. And then my final, it's not a question, it's kind of a question. I pulled up the language in the ballot measure, and it says right at the top, declares funding for homelessness services as a matter of metropolitan concern. And the ballot title actually doesn't say anything about housing. It's about services, agencies, and developing the plan. And a lot of what's in the explanatory statement is about services to people who are living outside. So to Jesse's point, yes, once we have more affordable housing, then we're going to need the services. And we have a humanitarian and a public health crisis on our streets right now. And so I'd like to know what's the plan for, at least initially, directing it to address the challenges that both Tony and Jesse brought up.
So just coming back briefly to your last question, I don't know if it's relevant, but there's a separate committee that's created at Metro, the Metro's what's being called Supportive Housing Services Oversight Committee, and I don't know what its relationship is to MPAC, but we do have to bring this LIP submitted to that oversight committee for approval. So, but I will follow up on whether it also comes to MPAC. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm guessing that committee is not doesn't have elected officials on it, and I think this is something that the elected officials of the cities and counties should weigh in on.
Yeah, there are elected officials. I think Commissioner Ryan is on it. They're there as they don't have voting authority, but they sit. But I take your point, and I will follow up with Metro and find out what their plan is. In terms of the sort of emergency crisis response, that is so the way that it has come to us from Metro is very much as this housing focused measure. And supportive housing more generally, and with some latitude to make investments in other areas. So, and that metric, the set of metrics that they adopted are sort of the the principal indicator of that. And we've been very clear, and I think they understand as well, that we face this immediate crisis on our streets. This is a resource that we can deploy, especially in the early years, towards addressing that. So, we're thinking about it in terms of some, the range of alternative shelter strategies. We heard it loud and clear from our community engagement, right? Like in the survey responses, supportive housing came in at the top, and then behavioral health interventions, and then shelter and emergency response services. It isn't only sort of community members who are being impacted by it. It's very much also the folks outside, and we're hearing that loud and clear. So we do have this opportunity with these resources to scale and to do some innovation around the types of sheltering strategies that we have available. We see in the data we heard from the surveys, that folks of color in particular who are in the unsheltered community are not showing up in some of these shelter spaces. There was even some data suggesting that among the unsheltered folks entirely, the folks of color had fewer resources, fewer tents, things like that. So, we expect to be able to use these dollars. We need to get it approved, and it's set up in the plan. It's called out at least in the early years, to be able to respond to the crisis with these dollars around shelter and outreach strategies. So it's in there, and if we can get the plan adopted, we will have the ability to spend these dollars on those sort of pre-housing, crisis intervention, behavioral health services, outreach services, sheltering services.
Thank you, Commissioner Fritz. I will now ask Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mark, and to your team for this information today. I have one last question, because Commissioner Fritz asked about actually seeing the plan, the entire plan. So I will look forward to receiving that. So Mark, you said that the county will vote on this proposal. You said Metro would vote on this proposal, but you did not say that the city council would have any say or input on this proposal. So I'm curious why the city council is not actually voting on this plan.
So as I understand it, the counties are the recipients, the way that this measure is structured. And so the money flows through the counties, and then the counties have the obligation to put forward the plan and account for the plan. So there isn't a formal role for the municipal jurisdictions.
I see. That makes sense. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I thought I was missing something, but okay, that makes sense. So my next question really has to do with how are we going to build these smaller social service systems, because I continue to be concerned that we have basically 3 organizations that provide temporary shelter today, and not quite sure what the plan is for building service providers, not just for temporary shelter space, but also around mental health treatment and other social service supports.
Yeah, Commissioner, I'll say that this is probably one of our biggest concerns, not just for us in Multnomah County, but in Washington-Clackamas County as well. I mean, this is such a significant increase in the available resources, and there is such a focus on culturally specific services and a range of services. We know that our current provider network, as strong as they are, they're not going to be able to carry the load of this work. And we've heard really clearly, Tony mentioned Shannon Olive, who's on the coordinating board, but from lots of smaller organizations, that they want to play a role, but they're going to need some resources to be able to build that relationship with us, right? To be able to contract with a public funder. And so, the first part is having conversations with some of those organizations about sort of what are the obstacles they face. Can we make some funding, some fund investments in them just to be able to build out their organizational capacity so they can be in those contractual relationships with us, so they can meet the expectations that we have as a public funder. And then hearing from them, what are we doing as a public funder that is making your job too difficult, right? Are there things that we can change in how we work with you as a community-based organization that will support your success and allow you to be successful even as a smaller organization right out of the gate. So there's some real work to do. We have some strategies that we've used to help small organizations in the past in terms of setting them up as subcontractors until they're able to sort of build out their infrastructure and then moving into a direct contractual relationship. But I think we're going to need to do more than that. We're going to need to figure out how to incubate essentially some of these organizations and make some investments in allowing them to get that foundation that they need in order to do the work and be partners with us. And Washington, Clackamas County have that need, and even more so, right? So I think this is going to be it is already a regional conversation we're having. We put a procurement out just recently to bring in some supports around organizational development and things like that we can offer to small organizations, because it's just so clearly going to be a critical element of the success of this measure.
Thank you for that, Mark. And I guess I was sitting with what Jesse shared, and Jesse, I will just say that what we know is locking people up for loitering or trespassing or sleeping in the park only exacerbates the problem of why people cannot find housing they can afford to live in. So I don't know, I don't think any of us are qualified to create community standards whereby people have to operate under those standards, otherwise they are voted off the island. I think we have to make sure that we invest the limited dollars that we have in a way that actually supports people living the best life they can live. There's, if you talk to 100 houseless people, you'll find 100 reasons why they're houseless. And so I in no way want to create some kind of community standard. I think what we need to do is create a whole host of housing options for people until we are able to have housing that people can afford to live in. We are building a lot of housing, but what we're calling affordable is certainly not affordable for people working 2 and 3 minimum wage jobs. And so I'm not wanting to blame the victims of people who have found themselves living on the street, but I do not think they deserve to be criminalized because they cannot afford to live in a city where they work, worship, have family, etc. So thank you for your time. Appreciate the information.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Mayor Wheeler.
Yeah, I absolutely hear what Jesse is saying, and what Jesse said resonates very, very clearly with me. And while I strongly supported this ballot measure, I helped raise funds for this ballot measure, I believe that this needs a crisis response. We're in an emergency situation right now with the situation on our streets. It needs a crisis response, not a bureaucratic response. I see this as a matter of immediacy and a matter of urgency. And as I listened to the presentation, first of all, I want to thank you all for what I thought was a very clear and thoughtful presentation. But I'm concerned that we're going about the planning process the way that Metro typically goes about planning processes. It's going, if I understood the timeline correctly, we don't even see funding for this until the spring. The first year, as I understood it from the presentation, is really dedicated towards partnership building, capacity building, infrastructural investments. What I don't see is a lot of investment in year one in moving people off the streets. And again, I'll come back to my core value. I don't believe having thousands of people on our streets is a humanitarian response. I believe it is exactly the opposite of that. And I do believe that community expectations matter. They expect fewer people living outside. And I've heard that loudly and clearly over the course of the last year and a half, having run for re-election as the mayor of this city. People are very upset by the number of people living on sidewalks, blocking household entries, blocking business entries, living in environmentally sensitive areas, living in areas where they themselves are subjected to public health situations that we should not accept just on a humanitarian basis. And so I agree with the fundamental point that Jesse made, which is we should always start with compassion. Our response should be compassionate, but we should also uphold community expectations. That is the balancing act that we are challenged with. And I want to point to a current today issue, which is Laurelhurst Park, which I think perfectly exemplifies the challenge and the balance that we have to strike. We have dozens and dozens of people living in an area where it's creating a problem for the people living there in terms of public health. It's creating a potential environmental and public safety set of concerns for other people who would like to be able to use the park. And rather than going in there and just telling everybody leave, what we did was we posted it. We gave people plenty of time to absorb not only the posting, but we also then sent in social workers to meet with individuals, and we sought additional shelter at the Mount Scott Community Center. We invited everybody to leave the park and go to the Mount Scott Community Center. It's indoors, it's out of the elements, it has access to water, to hygiene, potentially to other services. And people were given all of those humanitarian options. But at the end of the day, if we provide that humanitarian outreach and they say, no, thank you, then I believe we have an obligation to uphold community expectations. Those expectations are in part in statute. We have laws that are already on the books, and it's our duty to enforce those laws. And so I believe that's the balancing act. On one hand, we acknowledge that we have this crisis on the street, that it's urgent, that we want to get as many folks off the street as quickly and humanely as possible. But on the other hand, we have an obligation to everybody else in this community to uphold those standards. And what's going on at Laurelhurst Park, from my perspective as the mayor, I want people to know that is the template for the path ahead. Laurelhurst is not the only large-scale camp situation in this city which creates a public health, an environmental, or a public safety concern during this COVID crisis. And so we're going to take that same model and we're going to go to other areas. And I believe it would be very important for us to have access to resources to be able to address this urgent and immediate need on our streets today. So I hope as Metro and the county, and hopefully with the city's active engagement, I hope we balance the needs for housing over the long term, the withering need for support services and supportive housing. We all agree on that. My concern is there doesn't seem to be much of a sense of urgency or a sense that we're in an emergency situation right now today that requires resources as quickly as possible, helping us urgently and humanely moving as many people out of the elements and into other alternatives as quickly as possible. So that's my 2 cents and my hope and my personal expectations.
Thank you, Mayor. Commissioner Hardesty, is that from the last time your hand's up again?
No, I did raise my hand again because I absolutely agree with what the mayor just said. We're talking about dollars that may flow next year, and we have some sense of the limited dollars that will flow in the first year. But I absolutely agree with the mayor. If we're not doing anything to impact folks on the street today, that we're really not doing anything. And I know how hard Mark and his team works, but the reality is that we need a lot more temporary housing opportunities for folks, because in January, when the moratorium is over on evictions, if we think we have problems today, we haven't seen anything like what we're gonna see once that moratorium is lifted. We may or may not have a federal government by then, but even if we do, the ability to get resources to us in a swift manner is really going to be limited. And so while it's nice to think about what's possible in 2021 and 2022, today we have a humanitarian crisis on our street. that we appear to be turning a blind eye to. And again, Mark, no disrespect, you and I talk all the time. I know how hard you and your team are working. But again, have we thought creatively about other housing options, tiny homes, taking over a golf course? I mean, when you're in a crisis, normally what happens is the Red Cross comes in, sets up tents everywhere, and actually triages the most critical people first. I don't see any actions that actually leads me to believe that's what we're doing. And so, I agree with the mayor. I agree that today we are in a humanitarian crisis that we are responding to in a very bureaucratic manner. We have to have innovation. We have to have creativity. We have to do things that we never thought we would do. And I know the mayor is open to that because we've had these conversations in the past. And so maybe this isn't the conversation, but I am very open to a conversation with the county, a joint conversation with leadership to say, we are in a humanitarian crisis. What do we do now? Right? Not when the next bond money comes in, not when the next housing unit is built, because we know that will be just a tiny portion of what is absolutely critical for people to be safe in our community.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Let me look, is anyone else's hands up? Commissioner Fritz.
Thanks, Commissioner. I just wanted to add on the issue of mental health and people with disabilities, that we know that for that peer support groups are crucial to that, and they are not that expensive. I'm thinking of the North Star House. Now, obviously, the North Star House is probably not functional right now because of the pandemic, and peer-to-peer funding ought to be part of this. I also support what Mark and his team had said about directing the mental health care funding through the county. They do know where the gaps are, but the gaps are just huge. They are just huge. And I know that Commissioner Sharon Myron has been working on what needs to be addressed. So I certainly would expect a robust discussion of that once this plan gets to the county board. Also, for people with physical disabilities as well as mental health care challenges, I hope that we've been involving Disability Rights Oregon and other community groups that address the special needs of people who have physical impairments as well as those with mental challenges.
Yeah, Commissioner, I can just peer support services came out as a really powerful theme. It definitely shows up across the board. As a need for additional capacity there, and really I think Tony called it out too, right? There are organizations that are really peer led, so there was a lot of interest in looking for more resources for them to be able to be more part of these responses. To the question about behavioral health, so we've got a very close partnership with behavioral health on this. We're meeting regularly, looking at their sort of systems of care and where they're seeing the most people who are experiencing homelessness and how we can sort of help resource them to expand those services. So that's that from that within the county kind of lens. There's this resource is very much being viewed as where's the best place to invest it. And then with respect to physical disabilities, this has come up really has come quite a bit in our conversations because for a number of reasons. And so Aging and Disability Services has been one of our key partners in these discussions, because as we think about supportive housing, we're often thinking about behavioral health. And what we're learning, especially as the population ages, we see higher rates of physical disabilities, challenges with activities of daily living. So we actually, it was called out there on a slide, a recognition that we actually need to be investing some of these dollars in a kind of supportive housing that really addresses those physical needs and longer term physical care needs. In our supportive housing inventory, the way we typically think of it doesn't come with that kind of assistance. You sort of have sort of adult foster care or assisted living environments, and then you have supportive housing. And I think all of us who are in this work recognize that we've got a gap right now and a growing part of this population that's going to need accommodations around their physical needs. And right now our system doesn't have nearly enough of that. So that shows up in the plan as many things do, and just know that like that will be a very specific point of conversation as we think about these supportive housing units, just like recovery transitional housing will be. I mean, there have been some important kind of sub conversations and areas of feedback where we're very clear that our current system isn't doing enough in those spaces. And I'll just finish with coming back to the sheltering conversation. I mean, that was the other area, right? Like folks are really clear, and you can, if you see when you look at the plan, commissioners, that it's not called out enough, you should give us feedback. But we are very much endeavoring to be able to present a plan to Metro that gives us the latitude, as soon as the monies are there, to be able to make the kind of urgent investments in, and to your point, Commissioner Hardesty, especially, that's why we're framing it under COVID, is like the risk we see, not just to the folks who are already outside, but the folks who may be coming, if we aren't ready with some emergency interventions, is really significant. So we're trying to be planful and responsive to what the measure requires, but also looking for that latitude to respond urgently, given what we know we already have happening on our streets and what we are concerned could happen in the near future.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any other questions, Commissioner Hardesty?
Excuse me, Commissioner Ryan. I was just curious, Mark, if you feel the need to have a joint city-county meeting to talk about the current crises that we're in. Because I feel totally disconnected from what the county is doing around this issue. And again, I don't think we see a sense of urgency around dealing with today's problem. And we're talking about tomorrow's problem when we have additional dollars available.
Commissioner Hardesty, I appreciate what you just said. We're on that. That's actually what we're trying to push today. And the feedback we're getting will build momentum for that. The joint meetings that we've had of late have included both the chair and Commissioner Myron and the mayor and I. And what I'm learning is how important it is to see if the four electeds could actually get someone on the same page and aligned with where we need to go. And that way the staff could actually move the work. And so I think we're building momentum for that. And your questioning and the dialogue we're having today really moves that forward. So thank you. Yeah. We're coming close to our time stop, but I wanted to give a few more minutes if any of my colleagues have more questions, and then we will get the draft out and updated over the next week and take in this feedback. Any other questions? And I'll have just a few closing comments.
I just want to compliment Joshua. The outreach plan that he put together and actually executed during the height of COVID is pretty impressive, especially when you look at a lot of the very small organizations that he was able to connect to. So I just want to say job well done, Joshua. Don't know how you did it, but you did. Congratulations. Good job.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty.
Anyone else? Let me look at my hand raise function now that I know how to do that. All right, looks like no one's raising their hand. I want to start off by thanking Mayor Wheeler and his staff for the transition to the Joint Office Bureau assignment. Your office has been very, very helpful. And to my staff, especially Mark Bond, who has been driving the work, and we're making a lot of headway. I also want to just point out that this is a draft, and I want to appreciate Mark Jolin for being open and being transparent. And it's really clear that some of the themes that we got out of today is that, yes, no one's going to disagree that we need more housing, especially more affordable housing for the working poor in our city, the essential workers that really can't afford to live in Portland. I think at times of lockdown, we're always reminded of that. But we also really were reminded that housing alone does not solve houselessness. This is a very personal matter for me. It's what motivated me to run for office. I had a brother with severe mental health issues that were untreated, and over time, they just medicated with whatever drug they could get. Our family tried to house my brother, Tim. He wasn't able to receive that. His life spiraled to the point where it was about getting that fix, and it was sad. And so when I speak to the point about these wraparound services and behavioral health, it's an incredibly personal and lived experience for me. So I will constantly be pushing on this. And I also want to acknowledge, I hope, a turning point that no one has the moral authority on this issue. I think all Portlanders are really compassionate about the houselessness, and we want to provide real concrete solutions. And I think that the debate should be about how we hurt our heads figuring out how to implement these concrete solutions and know that we're all in this together. I want to say that I feel like this is hopefully a turning point. We have a lot of work to do, and we look forward to working with you, Mark, on the draft. And I think you saw by the engagement today that we'd like to figure out how this can come back to us as well, so that we can have a point of view on the final draft. As you know, we're a big partner in this on many levels, and one is through the investments. And it's an investment that we want to continue to feed, but we want to see concrete data and results. And I think I'll end with that. One frustration I've had is just knowing what the real baseline is and knowing what success looks like. And I think that that's what people around the city are all in to be helpful with. And so I want to thank you for your years and years of work in this area and for being willing to come to a body that is in the emergency of this situation. And therefore, we are coming at you with a lot of passion and a lot of concern and a lot of desire to not be in the same place we're in a year from now. And so Jessie doesn't have to feel like she's at another Groundhog's Day experience with coming to yet another meeting where it feels like it's the exact same meeting. So I look forward to working with all of you and of course with our partners at the county. And I think that's about it.
If I could just jump in here at the end, Commissioner Ryan, before I close it out, I just want to add my list of thanks. I want to thank Mark Jolin in the Joint Office of Homeless Services. I think you have probably one of the toughest jobs in the entire city. And you do it well, and you do it with professionalism, and you're great partners. And I want to thank you for that as well. And Joshua and Nui and Paul Stark, thank you for the great work that you do as well. And I want to thank folks for their testimony. I also want to thank my colleagues today. This is a really good and thoughtful discussion. Commissioner Ryan, I want to particularly appreciate you and your team for helping to orchestrate a great conversation this afternoon. Thank you, everybody. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.